Okay, hello everybody. Hello everybody, and I'd like to say very warm welcome to our conference, Wireless Radiation, the Elephant in the Classroom. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Erica Mallery-Bythe. Dr. Mallery-Bythe is the founder of Physicians' Health Initiative for Radiation and Environment, PHIRE, spelled PHIRE, and a special expert at the prestigious International Commission on Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. She spent a decade practicing as an NHS medical doctor within hospital medicine and has led trauma teams in and taught on emergency trauma medicine courses throughout the UK and abroad. In 2008, Dr. Mallery-Bythe began researching biological effects of non-ionising radiation with a special interest in electromagnetic hypersensitivity, and she formally transitioned from clinical medicine to full-time research in 2015. In addition to the groups already mentioned, she's an advisor to the Oceania Radiofrequency Scientific Advisory Association, Electrosensitivity UK, and International Guidelines on Non-Ionising Radiation, IGNIR. She's also an honorary member of the British Society of Ecological Medicine. She has provided evidence regarding radiation exposure and public health at the highest political level in the UK and Europe. She will first give us a short introduction to this topic and then lecture again after Dr. Davis on variations in human sensitivity. Thank you, Dr. Mallery-Bythe.
Thank you very much. I don't need to go through my declarations now. I'll add one, which is I'm also an advisor now to the Environmental Health Trust, and I also am incredibly honoured that we have Professor Davis, who's the former president of the Environmental Health Trust, with us here today. So with no further ado, we will move on. And I just wanted to highlight what I think is a really important headline from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. And this was from a couple of years ago, or 2020, saying that we're in danger of failing a generation of children. And they go on to talk about various health concerns that they're really worried about, because in some areas, morbidity and mortality in our children is increasing. And that's obviously something that as a group we have to take really seriously and look very carefully into any possible explanation for why that could be happening. And this whole conference today is dedicated to a subject that has remained very dark on this spectrum because medical doctors are not formally trained in non-ionising radiation health. So I really hope that we're going to illuminate a new area of medicine and science that is rapidly evolving in this conference today. And to begin, I wanted to bring us back to basics, really, and just think, on a very humble level, what does a child actually need in order to be healthy? And acutely, in the short term, to survive, if you like. Of course they need oxygen, water, shelter, food, but to flourish they need a lot more than that. They need an environment that is a genuine, natural, human environment. And in many different ways that has changed. But the one that we're going to really focus on today is electromagnetism, and I want to mention that of course natural light is part of that environment as well. Now, it's no secret that this is a contentious issue, and a scientific dispute is really healthy. It's one of the reasons that Sally Beer at the beginning drove home, please do ask your questions, because we know that this is a heated debate at present. And what's interesting about this particular one is quite polarised. And what we see here is one group of scientists who say, we've put some exposure limits in place and these are safe, you've got nothing to worry about. And often that's people deriving from the group that set the guidelines themselves. And these are guidelines that are in place for many years. But there's another extremely strong voice on this, a very big and rapidly growing expert community of scientists and doctors who say entirely the opposite, that these exposure limits are not safe, they're not protecting health, and in particular, they're not protecting our vulnerable groups. So with that in mind, we're going to discuss the very strong evidence on that second side of this debate, because it's often not heard. And again, keeping it very basic, because this is a basic introduction short talk. the reason I asked this question, and I'm not going to get into the spiritual nature of it or anything like that, it's far too vast, but in a very humble and simple sense to a medical doctor, in my previous life in accident emergency or in intensive care, this is a very simple question, because it is in itself electromagnetism. That is what tells us and gives us a clue about the presence or absence of life, and indeed whether it's resurrectable if it's there, because the EEG, the brain waves, show the electromagnetism of the brain, the ECG of the heart, even muscle action potential is electromagnetic. It's quite literally what makes us tick. So there's a really common sense theme here that I'm coming back to, that we should have always expected that all parts of the electromagnetic spectrum could interfere with our biology. Even our DNA has been shown to be structured like a fractal antenna. And we have some very important particles, as do many other species, called cryptochrome and magnetite, which are actually deliberately designed to sense these kinds of fields and potentially make use of them. And some species make obvious uses of them more than others. But we often thought for many years, even in the medical world, that the ionizing portion of the spectrum at the far end in blue here was the only bit that could really do damage and that people needed protection from. And as evidence has accumulated, it's very clear that actually the whole of this spectrum can interact with biology in a myriad of different ways. And we're focusing today on the radio frequency portion, that's wireless devices, and also we mustn't forget these are usually pulse modulated at extremely low frequencies at the lower end. Things like your household wiring, your overhead power cables, those are extremely low frequencies, and both are important in health, as of course is visible light. So these are some common devices, and of course more on the market continuously, and I know Professor Davis will talk a little bit more on some of that as well. But you might, people often, in order to reassure, say you don't need to worry about these new exposures, because actually radio frequency radiation has been in our environment since before the dawn of man. And that's a bit of a distortion of the reality of this. We know, one of the reasons our planet is called a Goldilocks planet is because life, and this isn't just human life, this is all life, has a very delicate and specific balance where things must be just right. And that is all aspects of our environment. And we know that even small changes can cause profound biological disruption. But this is the one, again, that is so often not talked about. And whilst, yes, there was some RF around before the dawn of man, it didn't look like this. So we now see 10 to the 18, that's a billion or a quintillion times higher intensities of this portion of the spectrum than was there in before man. And it's very unnatural in a number of different ways. So you can see here in green how background radiation dips at around 1 gigahertz. And unfortunately, this natural radio quiet zone is the exact area of the spectrum that we have filled in with these anthropogenic or man-made frequencies. And this is a logarithmic scale on the left, which means the difference between the bottom and top of this chart is far greater than it looks. Hence the term 10 to the 18 times higher. Massive intensity rises in this previous natural quiet zone. So despite all of that, you would naturally, I think, assume that there are safety limits in place to protect your biology. And I certainly thought that for many years, all the way through my career in the NHS, for sure. And it wasn't until I started reading the source literature that it became very clear to me that that is unfortunately not the case. Because here in the UK, we use something called the ICNIRP guidelines, and they were designed to stop your tissue from heating, because the same frequency ranges as you get in a microwave oven are the same ones your mobile phone uses. It's just they're much more intense in a microwave oven. So there's obviously the potential for tissue heating, and they didn't want to be literally cooking your tissues. And these limits were set to stop that happening. And the problem is there's a grey scale of effects that happen well under that tissue heating limit. And these exposure limits were not designed to protect against those low intensity effects. And for those of you, I'm delighted to say we've got quite a lot of medical doctors and scientists in the audience today. We've also got a lot of lay people, so I'm going to continuously be giving resources for the scientific and medical brains to dig further, and everyone else. And this is an important publication that I've co-authored with my colleagues at the International Commission on Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. That's ICBEEMF.org. You can find this publication freely available as a PDF. And what we map out here is 14 assumptions that underlie the current exposure limits, which are not valid, which invalidate the limits themselves. And we've got some very detailed science available for you to go into that in more detail, and a fact sheet to distill it down for those who don't want to get so deep into the science. And of those 14 assumptions, I'm actually only talking about these two in red, the vulnerable groups and increased susceptibility. But all of these are really important, and I just want to mention, so these last two, these limits were not set up to look at environmental effects. They were only designed to protect human health. So there's never been a formal guideline put together for protecting the environment, and of course 5G is very novel, and we have almost no literature at all on looking at that in combination with all of the other frequencies that are still active. So ICNIRP, as I mentioned, are the group that set the guidelines we're using here in the UK. And very importantly, in 2002, they themselves pointed out that children, the elderly and chronically ill may all be more susceptible to the effects of radiofrequency radiation. So they questioned, do we need separate guidelines to keep those groups safe? And they anticipated failure where there could be concomitant exposures to synergistic toxicants, like, for example, co-carcinogenic effects. And also where there were underlying health complaints that might elevate sensitivity levels. So what was a great shame was that they abandoned these actually very important scientific principles. And you can see that, in fact, in 2020, they did not, they used the adult limits for children, and they set no limits for people with EHS at all. The reason they gave for not giving special limits for children was because they said their core body temperature doesn't increase more than that of an adult. Now, what's interesting is that the exposure limits actually do allow the core body temperature to rise by a degree, which to many medical doctors, if they understood and knew this, would be deeply concerning. And what happens if you have a child that is already febrile? Pushing them up by another degree can actually really be biologically significant. Now, children might have quite good thermoregulation mechanisms, but it's not all about core body temperature. That's a very strong message of these talks. That is a gross oversimplification of the truth of the biology here. So, in reality, the unique anatomy, tissue dielectrics, and physiology of children all make them potentially more vulnerable. And you can see in this graphic here how much more, we've got references in that first publication I told you about to all of this, these important papers. One of them showing, for example, 30-fold increases expected in the hippocampus, the delicate brain structure, important brain structure of a child. Now, we're quite reductionist these days in science and medicine, and we like to know every single step in the pathway. If A causes B, what are all the steps by which you get there? And I think that's great, you know, that's very important scientifically, but we shouldn't allow the lack of understanding of that to hold back important public health policy. And this has been a big problem, especially given that we actually do have valid mechanisms that really make sense to explain some of the symptoms and chronic effects that we're seeing. And one of those is oxidative stress. So many of you will have heard of this. Many of you will take antioxidants or look for foods that are rich in antioxidants because they mop up these free radicals, which can cause aging and degeneration of cells. Now, how robust is this? If I'm saying this is a mechanism of harm by EMF below the allowable guidelines, by the way, you want to know how strong that evidence is. You should want to know. And the reason I'm comfortable sharing this with you is because there are hundreds of papers that show this as a valid mechanism, and a very high percentage. So back in 2015, Yakimenko et al. Showed here 93% of studies, and that was well over 100 papers. Then in the Lancet Journal of Planetary Health, they looked at over 200, and found 89%. And then ICB, the paper I shared with you at the beginning, we have documented 124 out of 131 studies, all showing this as a valid effect. So it becomes pretty indisputable at this level. And one of the things oxidative stress can do is it can damage DNA. So this is an important study that was EU funded. And you can see on the left here, that's a healthy ball of DNA with no toxic exposure in it. It should look like that, like a big radiant sun. In the middle, that's DNA that's been irradiated with the equivalent of about 1,600 chest x-rays. We know that will do DNA damage. And you can see that damage in this comet-like tail of fragments. Then on the right there, that is only 24 hours of mobile phone radiation at below the current allowable guidance levels. So when we look at these kinds of cellular level effects or molecular level effects, we have to assume that if those are allowed to continue, we will see this grayscale of acute short-term illness, which, if that is not treated, moves on to long-term illness. And of course, some people won't get conscious acute illness. They will just arrive at a chronic diagnosis. And DNA damage is something obviously implicated in carcinogenesis, in cancer formation. And it's also implicated, the oxidative stress is implicated in many other long-term health consequences. Radiation can affect all of our bodily systems, so it's no surprise that we see all of these different endpoints that can be associated with that. So just to touch on chronic health effects very briefly one more time, and my colleague Professor Deborah Davis is going to speak more about carcinogenicity. But just to point out that in our fact sheet, we have shown that we've got references for very robust epidemiological studies finding increased risk of brain tumours, particularly schwannoma and glioma of the brain. And this was reinforced by animal studies showing concordance of data, really strongly corroborating this as a valid effect. So the International Agency for Research on Cancer, even before these large-scale animal studies were performed, actually designated this as a group to be a possible human carcinogen, and we are still waiting for them to reassess this. This was in 2011. And unfortunately, some of the relevant tumour types that I mentioned are escalating or have been shown to be rising in young people in the UK population. This graphic comes from Alistair Phillips, who will be speaking to you this afternoon after the break. So you might be asking yourself, if the International Agency for Research on Cancer is calling this a possible human carcinogen, and we've got signs that our children have relevant cancers rising, why are we not being warned to restrict their use? And that would be a really, I think, a really healthy and important question. And the truth is you are. It's just really well buried on an NHS website. So this is one of the areas where you can see a warning, pointing out that children under 16 should not be using mobile phones unless it's an emergency, and keeping calls short. This is so important. This needed to be disseminated to parents, to schools, to governing bodies, and of course to children themselves, who often have very impressive capacity. So we've seen so much in the news recently about phone bans, and this centres around distraction, addiction, social media use, etc. But we really must bring this to strengthen that call, because there are so many reasons. And just because you take phones away and perhaps store them in the corner of a classroom, that won't necessarily fix the radiation exposure all on its own. But also, of course, we've got iPads, tablets, wireless printers, other gadgets in the classroom that we need to be thinking about. So you can have a comparable, or even in some cases found to be higher, specific absorption rate, which is a measure of dose of radiation from an iPad, for example, than from a phone in some cases. So we mustn't give this mixed messaging. You know, if the government is warning that children should be keeping their phone calls short, they should be warning about all of these other exposures at the same time. And what I was talking about there in terms of dose was really about intensity. And power and intensity are not the end of this story. It's very tempting for us to think things like, well, the higher the frequency, the worse it is, or the higher the power, the worse it is. And it's actually scientifically really not that simple. Why? Because we can have low intensity windows where actually a low intensity of radiation can have more of an effect than its higher counterpart. We also have frequency windows of specific frequencies that seem bioactive in specific types of body physiology. And all of these other aspects are important. The signal shape is very important, the morphology, whether it's intermittent or continuous. If it's pulsed, that's been shown in some studies to have more of a response biologically. And of course, our children are not all like the routers that came off the production lines. They all have different levels of vulnerability, and we'll talk more about that in my second talk. So that was a quick, brief introduction to some basic concepts. I hope that's been useful. And I'm not going to take questions now, but if you have any, please do write them down on your cards and pencils, and we've got more at the front if anyone didn't get one. And I'm going to hand back over to Sally now, who's going to introduce our featured speaker of the day. Thank you so much.